Dr. David Martin, welcome to the Truth Contract.
Wonderful to be here, David. It's always good to see you.
Thank you very much indeed for setting aside some time. I know you're very busy. You're in Las Vegas today, and I'm in the Cotswolds in the UK. I don't think I could think of two more different places.
Yeah, I think you'd need to be somewhere in the Himalayas to get further away, but yes.
So, David, you and I were introduced to each other about a year and a half ago through a mutual friend, and I've always enjoyed every conversation we've had. And I've watched just about every interview you've ever given. And one of the things in preparing for this conversation was writing an introduction to you, which I realized all the material I'd put together could have taken up an hour. So, how do you describe yourself to someone new that you meet today and explain to them who you are and what you do?
Well, at least aspirationally, David, and I'm putting the caveat there intentionally, I would say that I am currently conducting my own experiment on what the capacity of humanity can be when it is entirely at full liberty to engage all of its faculties to engage the world in which I find myself. And so I would say I am a man who is doing his best to fully live as a fully functioning human. Now, the reason I say that is because that's probably the only truth I have, because all of the nouns and adjectives I would use to describe myself, to paraphrase Buckminster Fuller, misrepresent me by association. And as Bucky said, I think of myself as a verb, not a noun. And I think that there's a great deal of resonance in my own life to that phrase, because if we think of ourselves as the object of the evidence of what we've done, whether that's an academic accomplishment, whether that's a social accomplishment, whether that's an executive role or what have you, people have an association that links the whatever they think that noun or adjective is to a reference that they have. And I am trying to follow the Native American tradition of erasing the footsteps light on the path, where you demonstrate what is possible, but you make it very difficult for someone to follow you. Because the goal is to allow every person to, in fact, find their own journey. So that's a long way of saying that that's actually, I think, who I am. The attributes of my activities, obviously, over the last now 35, almost 40 years, have been a person who sees and perceives the world a very different way. And I see myself in many respects through the lens of almost an ambassador to unseen dimensions. I see things, I access information, I access, resources, what have you. And whether it's physical energy, whether it is, functioning a intelligence that is not commonly accessible, whatever those manifestations are certainly objects and things. But I think if at the end of my days people said, I think he lived, I would be happy with that, because I think that's exactly what I do. I think I live.
Well, apocryphally, whenever I mention your name to someone, they say, "Oh, yes, I think I've heard his name. I think I know who he is." And I show them a photograph of you from the internet on my phone. They go, "Oh, that's the guy
Yeah.
who did that talk at the EU in May 23."
Yeah.
They
Yeah,
all,
that is the I can't escape a police lineup anywhere on the planet now, because
how many
because
people
that
in the world have watched that talk?
we've been advised by people who do the things that they do to try to validate the difference between a glancing blow and a engagement. And I always find it somewhat suspicious, because if somebody says, well, it was broadcast on a television and there were a billion people watching that television, well, were there a billion or were there 500 million? I don't know. What I do know is that the last time I heard anyone report on the distribution of that, it was reported to be the most watched piece of media in human history at 4 billion views. Um,
I've
and
read
that
that.
was that has been, and once again, I I think what that means, because I know it was broadcast on a few national television channels to the entirety of certain countries that have very large populations. I do know that the number of people who actually saw it versus the number of people who had the option to see it is probably a different number. But what I can tell you is the evidence of something at that scale is a daily occurrence now, which is whether I'm at an airport, whether I'm at, yesterday in Houston, Texas, and in Las Vegas, I had people who I had no previous interaction with interact with me around oh, you are that guy. So I don't know. I would say by frequency of association and by the looks and stares and points and the people that have the ability to overcome whatever their social awkwardness is and walk up and speak to me, um, a lot of the world's seen it.
Yes. I always describe you as polymath. Um, and you're described by people I introduce you to as, oh, the bald guy with the bow tie who did that big talk at the EU.
Yeah, there you go. The bald guy with a bow tie. I let everybody down by not wearing a bow tie this morning. So
No, never mind. Anyway, where do I start with questions for the man who has evidence-based answers to almost any question I've ever dreamt up? So I want to start here. Given that you have provided more receipts, evidence about the true COVID-19 story from its
yeah,
ideation to its implementation, and have provided unambiguous evidence, nearly always citing the papers written by the perpetrators, why do you think that the powers that be have not jumped on all of your evidence and changed course versus what appears to be the case of doubling down on the status quo?
so I think there are probably three dimensions to that answer. The first dimension is that when you understand, and this, by the way, my first observation of this was back in Central America in the 1980s when I got involved in these kinds of projects. And that was famously what became the Iran Contra scandal. There is a central fear that is held by anyone holding power that if one of the little pieces of wood in the Jenga tower get pulled out, that the whole tower falls. And the problem is that when you have built a system, certainly since Bretton Woods in 1944 in the case of the United States, and certainly since the 17th century in the case of the UK, when you've built a system on the illusion of power beyond the evidence that you actually have, and to do that, you rely on what was then Lord Burleigh, or in modern era, was the wonderful conflicts that were set in motion by Bretton Woods. When you rely on illusion to support your power, then the risk is if you take any illusion out, then the entire apparatus fails. So at the macro level, I think the absolute doubling down, to use your term, of holding on to a narrative that has the evidence so strongly counter it that it's laughable. I think that the real core issue is if we are seen to be naked with this particular issue, then we open up the possibility of being seen to be naked everywhere, and we are unwilling to be seen through that lens. So I think that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the second thing is, and this is something that's very difficult for people in what they think of themselves as a civilized world can wrap their head around. I think we live in a massive illusion that the current, let's call it Westphalian nation state model, is somehow a of the people, by the people, for the people model, because we are beaten every day with the syncopation of democracy and liberty and freedom and all of these kinds of catchphrases, and we're hypnotized into this cacophonous, nearly metronomic mind control that says that we are a democracy, we have people's liberty, we are all about the human. And the fact of the matter is, the evidence is that the systems that we have are set up for horrific abuses, mostly involving the vast transfers of wealth from one population to another population. And that, by the way, is never a downward distribution. It's always an upward distribution. So if we think of, the very famous comments by Roosevelt, we need to have a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Well, implicit in that is you have a house if you have a garage, right? But if you ask the question, why did we need to have everybody have a house with a garage, with a car in every garage? That had nothing to do with the human factors of a more distributed sense of wealth or space or rights or land or title or ownership. It had everything to do with the origination of debt so that bankers could put mortgages in place to effectively put a tax, in this case a consumption tax, on every human experience. And you go back and you look at it and you go, oh, well, that doesn't sound as romantic. We wouldn't call it American dream. We'd call it an American nightmare. But we don't want to see that there is a functional money laundering mandate that lives inside of almost every one of these illusions. And by the way, you can't find an illusion where somebody didn't grossly profiteer on the back of it. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is a personal thing. There are an enormous number of people who think that power only comes as an inverse correlation to transparency. So we have to maintain secrecy. We have to be smarter than the common man. We know more. We have national security apparatuses, and we have secret services, and we have all these kinds of things. And I represent the biggest threat to that model that probably is walking around, at least one of the biggest threats, because I'm not relying on those conditions. In fact, my brand is transparency, and my brand is a public visibility, and my brand is not only sharing the information and insights that I have, but my brand is also the self-critique where I share my own challenges, my own failings, my own journey. And in a world where secrecy is the correlate to power, and where sleight of hand and illusion is the currency of manipulation, because if I have blackmail on you, if I have this or that or the other thing, I can get you to do what I want you to do. Well, I represent the biggest threat to that model that exists, because I don't have a skeleton in a closet, because I neither have a skeleton nor a closet. And because of that, I think that validating my voice, and this is why I said it's personal, would suggest that there is a powerful currency beyond the currency of secrecy, sleight of hand, blackmail, and all of the horrible things that are done to keep people in line. And the last thing anybody in power wants is the notion that maybe a human being, without an enormous amount of the classic sense of agency, not a lot of money, not a lot of influence, not a lot of brand control, not a lot of handlers, all these kinds of things, that a human being can actually get stuff done. And that's terrifying if you know that the only way you get stuff done is manipulative uses of power. And so I think those three things, and maybe that's a longer answer than you were looking for, but I think those three things are the three reasons why you cannot admit to the evidence that I put straight in front of you. And I use Rand Paul as an example. He, for 4 hearings with Anthony Fauci, had in his possession the letter from NIAID from October of 2014, where in that letter, NIAID said that the manipulation that was being done on SARS coronavirus was going to move from an in vitro gain of function research to an in vivo gain-of-function research, meaning that in University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's labs, they were going to put this chimera, this weaponized version of SARS-CoV, into living systems. And it explicitly says this project is a gain-of-function project subject to the gain-of-function moratorium. The last paragraph on the first page of that letter states that UNC Chapel Hill is receiving authorization to continue the research. So, during a moratorium, which the average human being hearing the word moratorium would say that has something to do with arresting an activity, during the gain-of-function moratorium, because it was funded by Anthony Fauci, because it was part of a strategic plan Anthony Fauci had put in place, he said, despite the existence of the moratorium, continue on. And here's the downward spiral of that story, which leads to the smoking gun of COVID. Because in February of 2016, that very project stated, and I am now quoting, WIV1 poised for human emergence. Well, what's WIV1? That is the Wuhan Institute of Virology Chimera 1. That is the thing that we call COVID-19. And in 2016, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they said it was poised for human emergence. Now, there is no question that there was a gain-of-function study done in violation of the moratorium, and it was done in the United States, and it was done on the Wuhan Institute of Virology virus. Let's get really clear.
Mhm.
And we still believe that we need to have a hearing to understand the source of the pathogen when it is literally published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And Bat Lady Zhengli Shi, the person who is attributed to be associated with probably the lab leak in China, is thanked in the final acknowledgement of the 2016 paper for supplying the genetic information that allowed UNC Chapel Hill to make the deadly pathogen. So, all the cast of characters that we were told were brand new. We never heard of Wuhan Institute of Virology. We never heard of Zhengli Shi. We never heard of all these things. The entire cast of characters has a full playbill. It's like you went to the West End and you watched Andrew Lloyd Webber, and they had everybody, including the lighting specialist, including the choreographer and the dressmaker and everybody else. They're all on the page, and no one can find it. And you look at that and you go, okay, this is the problem. Hidden in plain sight is the evidence of the crime. Hidden in plain sight is the evidence of the perpetrators. And we simply cannot, as a society, accept that maybe we've been lied to across the board.
Well, we'll come on to that a bit later in this conversation. I love your three vectors. There are now literally thousands of experts all around the world, doctors, virologists, epidemiologists, oncologists, who have revealed how bad the mRNA jabs are and will continue to be. So what do you think the world will look like in 5, 10, 15 years' time if the mRNA rollout continues?
Well, I already know what it looks like if we stop today. And if we stop today, we would see the aspirational goal that Bill Gates set at the early part of the 2010, 2011 time period when he was promoting the decade of vaccines at the World Health Organization. He said that his estimation was that we would have a 10% reduction in the population courtesy of vaccine technologies. Now, he actually said that, so we do have that in recorded material. We've been told by fact checkers that he didn't mean to say a reduction in the population. What he meant to say was people would become more healthy, and as more healthy, they would have less children, and that's how we would get to this net population reduction. Now, ironically, he didn't say any of the stuff that the fact checkers said he meant to say, and he still has never said what the fact checkers say he meant to say, but they've said it, so that must be correct. Let's take a step back and suggest that maybe he meant what he said. That means you have, somewhere between 750 and 800 million people dead. More importantly, because the spike protein in every mRNA shot does reside both in the male testes and in the female ovaries, and we've already seen the evidence of some of the earliest papers suggesting that somewhere around 60% of the viable eggs in a young woman are killed by the spike protein, that we are going to have a significant reduction in birth rate, which means that from a socioeconomic standpoint and from a social standpoint, we are going to have far less children than we need to sustain viable populations. Now, a viable population, depending on how you theorize the world, is a population that has some form of a replacement metric that says as the elderly die off, we need to have some set of younger people coming along to replace that. And obviously, for those who are very fascinated with the idea of a world that needs less people, this is a very effective way to get to less people. And not surprisingly, we see this dynamic of the decimation, literally, to use the Latin term, the decimation of the population occurring simultaneous with this redefinition of what it means to work. And so we have automation, we have AI, we have all of the, all of the technological technocracy elements that are intervening. What that leaves us with is a world where conveniently we will have far fewer people. Those far fewer people are going to necessarily have less to do because we've decided that we are going to obviate the need for most of them. And rather than stimulating creativity and saying, let's make a better world, what we're going to do is do a better job of essentially hospicing a social and political and economic system that itself should be critiqued and then ultimately should be considered for replacement. And so where we are in this arc is that the reduction in population is an absolute. It's happening. I mean, David, if I had said the word turbo cancer 5 years ago, you wouldn't have known what I was talking about. That would have been, you would say, well, is it car drivers that get it from working on carburetors? Like what's a turbo cancer? Now that is synonymous with everyday's headline. Somebody else has died of a turbo cancer. Everybody's finding stage 4 cancers when they first find cancer. Well, we know that was going to happen, and we knew it in 2018, by the way. This was all published before any of the first shots were given. The pseudouridine that was included in the shot and the propylene glycol that was included in the shot, we knew, in the case of pseudouridine, we knew was going to shut off the body's natural response to fight cancer. And we knew it. It was published, and it was determined to be too lethal to use, and both BioNTech and Moderna included it in the shot. That's premeditated murder. They knew they were going to kill people. That was not let's go into the kitchen and, there's arsenic here. Why don't we just chuck a little arsenic in the brownies? This was willful, evidence-based science. Bobby Kennedy famously had an interview on CNN where he was talking about what evidence-based science is. Well, evidence-based science is you knew that you were putting a lethal agent into a thing when you put it in, and you knew it was lethal when you put it in. Now, unfortunately, even now, we have the HHS in the United States, you have the NHS in the UK, who still say that it's appropriate to inject people with mRNA, despite the fact that they know. This is not a hunch. It's not a statistical possibility. It's a certainty. They know that using mRNA with pseudouridine is lethal, and they still are doing it. So the problem is that we're not evidence-based science. We're selective, propaganda-based promotion of these rules and regulations. Nobody's even considering evidence-based science, because if you did, you'd say including a lethal ingredient into a shot is a bad idea. But nobody's bothering with that. So the answer is, to your question, we are going to have, and we are having, but we're going to have even more, severe population reduction And from an economic standpoint, that has a huge ripple effect because that means the fabric of our socioeconomic systems will collapse. It has to collapse because we rely on a very nearly frenetic consumer-based system for our current economic systems. And if you have fewer people doing it and you have fewer resources for those people to do it, then the model that we think we have on our economic systems is all going to change.
As well as pseudo-uridine, there was SV40,
Correct.
and there's aluminium and mercury and
Yeah.
and yesterday I interviewed Professor Angus Dalgleish, who was obviously, you know him, I know,
Yes, indeed.
and he was explaining how in his entire 45-year career he's never seen turbo cancers like he's now
Yeah.
witnessed, all of which he attributes to the COVID jabs. But in a way, whether it's the reduction in the population or it's vaccine-induced autoimmune deficiency syndrome, immune fatigue, mental health issues, we're going to see, it feels to me, even if we stopped it tomorrow, a dramatic reduction in productively
Correct.
positive productive workers.
Oh, indeed. And you see that, by the way, in all of the, really intervened countries where the injections were really mandated as a condition of access or employment or any of the things that were done to coerce the population. You already see this. You see massive, massive numbers of, people that go from work from home to unengaged to unemployed to using the term that the United States Department of Labor uses, which is permanently disappointed. I love that term, permanently disappointed. I don't know who the nefarious actor was that decided that was a good phrase to put on a person. But yes, the point is that it's not just the fatality rate, which is actually quite high and going up. If we stop tomorrow, we're already off the cliff. There's no the cliff is actually already done. We're over the edge.
So it's not just people who have died and will die, it's people who end up being disabled or
Correct.
injured, and more to the point, caring for the injured and the disabled.
Yeah, remember that every single permanently disabled person disables 3 other persons at a minimum. Because the minute you have to have care equals, you know, 24-hour, 3 people on a rotating schedule on the best of days. So a 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 ratio of incapacitation is what we're looking at.
On my walk in the park this morning with the dog, in anticipation of this conversation, I was thinking about the moral dilemma for the politicians, the lawmakers, the establishment, that I see as follows. So, if going back to my earlier question, everyone in Donald Trump or Keir Starmer turned around tomorrow and said, "Press pause on this. I've got new information, and I think it might not be as safe and effective as we were told, and in fact, it might even have been harmful." If they did that, the legal claims
Yep.
or class action suits from companies, trade unions, employees in the US or the UK could end up in the trillions.
Yes.
So they don't want to press that pause button quite yet. And they're sitting there thinking, if we press pause and we had all of that litigation that cost us trillions, that's not a good outcome. So we're going to have to keep letting people take this stuff, even though
Yep.
we know it's harmful, because of the Jenga metaphor that you used
Yep.
earlier on, because we can get away with it.
Yep.
Okay, so if it stopped tomorrow, we're going to see moving more and more towards the cliff, or if not going over the end of it.
Yep.
But if we don't stop it, we're going to speed up the fall from the cliff and the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So now, many economists that I've read and followed over the last few years all seem to have 2028 as
Yes.
some. Now, maybe they all talk to each other, but they've all got their different reasons for talking about 2028. And it seems to be a major year in terms of the world's economy. What's
Yes.
your take on that?
Well, I think I'm the one that started that date in my presentation, certainly back in 2003 and then in 2007. So maybe, who knows, maybe I have manifested in some sort of metaphysical intention way. Maybe I secreted it into existence by talking about it. But the ingredients for 2028 are most notably and in probable order the end of the U.S. Treasury cycle, where if you mark to market the assets that are called U.S. Treasury notes, 2028 is the date when we no longer can refinance, because of the negative interest rates, any of the debt that everyone was forced to buy since 1971, since Nixon addicted the world to buying U.S. debt. And there's no way to flip the debt. The way the U.S. Treasury works is we refinance debt. We never pay it off. We refinance it, and so the absence of the ability to refinance the debt is kind of part one of the problem. But part two of the problem is the Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid trust fund system, which is the money that's the backstop for the assets required to support Medicare and Medicaid in the United States. And because the trust fund has been mismanaged and horrifically by statute, forced to buy assets that have little to no value, the trust fund goes to zero. And what that means is that one way or another, about 18% of the United States GDP goes out of existence in 2028. And the reason why I say that is actually, there are a bunch of people who don't like how I say that. And it doesn't matter whether they like it or not. I'm right. There's two things that can happen. You can either cut it off and get rid of Medicare and Medicaid, in which case 86 million people are without health care. And that means that the costs to society become exorbitant, because if you take most of that 86 million in the population of the United States, if you take most of that 86 million, you'll realize that they're the ones that have very expensive chronic disease. And so what we'll have is 86 million people that are going to be without care, that ultimately will die relatively quickly. And I want you to hear that number, 86 million people. That's a lot of people in the United States. Roughly between a quarter and a third of the population. So we've got a very interesting, that's an adult population, but that's a big number. There's a bigger problem, which is, let's say we want to fix it. Well, if we want to fix it, we have to increase, in the Social Security Administration concept, we have to increase the Social Security tax by 18%. So it doesn't matter which side of the coin. We fix it and tax into fixing it, or let it go. The effect is the same, that 18% of the GDP of the United States goes away. Well, that is a single hit consequence that no economy ever in any system has ever been able to survive. When you have a component, in the case of this conversation, the component of healthcare, which is one of the largest contributors to the overall GDP, and the service economy, the actual manufacturing of healthcare equipment, drugs, all the kinds of things that we do in healthcare, that's an 18% contributor to the GDP. You take that out of commission one way or the other, either accretive tax or obviation of the system. And in both instances, we have a death knell to the economy that we cannot fix. And I said very famously in 2011, after the second GFC, that the last year we could have fixed it was 2010. That's when we could have fixed it with a more aggressive both infrastructure taxing system on the economy, but also on a more radically transformed approach to how we invest the assets of Social Security. In 2010, we still could have fixed it. In 2011, we went off the cliff. And since 2016 and 2017, which is when we manipulated the interest rates to essentially negative interest rates, from that time on, we've already been, in the Warner Brothers cartoons where Wile E. Coyote is running off the cliff and his legs keep spinning and he's running past the clouds, but he knows that if he looks down, then he'll fall. Well, we're running past clouds, and we've been running past clouds since 2016. 2028 is the look down year where you have to look down. And if we look down in 2028, what we're also going to find is there's an anvil over our head, which Acme always conveniently put in the cartoons, where you fall and then an anvil comes down and smashes you. And the anvil is the explicit dependency we've built on medical device and drug manufacturers in the United States to support our geopolitical system. Because the graft and corruption that goes into supporting what we call free and fair elections is, without question, largely financed on the back of pharmaceutical and medical companies. In fact, pharmaceutical interests have a 4 times greater economic contribution to the legislation of the United States than any other industry in the United States. So now think about what I just said. The fabric of the political system is on the warp thread of the corruption of our medical economic system. So now I pull that out and I have a incapacitation of 86 million of the population or more. And what you have is what most people would describe as somewhat of an apocalyptic horizon, because you cannot will that away. You can't wish that away. You can hope that a lot of people die from the COVID shot between now and then, which, by the way, there are people who genuinely are cheering for that outcome, right? Get rid of the over 65s and you don't have to worry about them not getting Social Security. And that's something that was part of the overall plan in 2020 with this campaign of terror. This is part of the apparatus to reduce that population. But the fact of the matter is 2028 is a statistically certain, not theoretically certain. It's a statistically certain perturbation that we have no current leadership focused on.
Is the apocalypse or the devastation that you've just described inevitable,
Correct.
Or is it avoidable?
No, it's not avoidable. It's not avoidable. And there, like I said, 2011 was the last time we could have done something. So we're way past the edge. That's why I spent months and years lecturing 2007 to 2011, lighting every candle I could light to try to get people to look at it. And nobody wanted to, because remember, 2008, we had the GFC. 2010, 11, 12, we had the second bump in the road. Everybody was focused on making sure banks and insurance companies survived. Nobody wanted to look at the underlying tragedy we were creating. And I have, you can still find them on grainy YouTube videos. My Arlington Institute speech, where I talked about what I called the House of Cards, that speech in 2007 is something that, is once again recorded immutably. You can't unrecord it. It's there. And it's a very interesting conversation because I laid out exactly what I just got done telling you. But I did it in 2007, trying to alert policymakers that this is something we still could have done something about. Now, just to do the flip side of this story, just to make sure people aren't trying to get butter knives out of drawers and ending themselves with very slow motion deaths. Let me get really clear on the fact we will not only survive, but we will thrive this. The system that's failing is a system that did not serve the public interest in the first place. The system that's failing is a system that actually appropriated human wealth and consolidated in the hands of banks, insurance companies, politicians, and so forth. So my encouragement is, let's celebrate the end of a dysfunctional and harmful system. Let's not sit here morose going, oh my God, we're off the edge of a cliff. Well, great. It was a horrible, horrible plateau to live on. So, we could have climbed down it. We could have fallen down it. But the plateau sucks because it excludes populations. It makes only the rarefied, the ones with enabled power to enjoy the benefits of the system. Those were the only winners. So seeing this particular system die is actually something that we should celebrate. We shouldn't, wax whimsical over the great old days of the slavery, of the tyranny of 1930s and 40s mortgages, and, the socialist programs we put in place at the end of the Second World War to make sure we socialized things like medicine and food and all of the industrial productions of all the livelihoods that we all have. So, we could call this the emancipation of humanity if we wanted to. But most people look at it going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And I'm saying, well, the great news is the sun will rise the next day. You'll wake up the next day and we'll start participating in a different world, which is going to be a lot of fun.
As I've been saying for the last year with everyone I've been talking to about the truth contract, I keep saying the system is completely broken.
Correct.
And is beyond repair. And actually, we need to focus on the new system.
Correct. But I love where you're going with that. But what I would also say is, it's not just we need to focus on a new system. We need to examine not the system that failed, but the ontology beneath the system that we don't want to reproduce.
Yes.
Because remember, and you've done a beautiful job of laying out this lovely architecture of the anatomy of the failure, which I actually really, really appreciate. But I think that if you turn that, that microscope lens to the next level of magnification, maybe, what you find is that we have a ontology and an epistemology that is actually quite more problematic, which is we as humans observe the systems around us, matter and energy and universe and everything else, as that which we at least have stewardship over, and I would go as far as say the vast majority of us have eminent domain and dominion over. And rather than seeing ourselves participating with the universe, we see ourselves lording over the universe. And as such, we have built very broken systems where we've been very reductionist. We've been very, prone to turning that into systems of planned and managed scarcity. And so we've got a perception problem that then turns into a imposed and entirely capricious scarcity, access manipulation kind of approach to how we organize our systems. And we have to tear that apart.
Yeah.
We also have we also have a horrific obsession about wanting to pretend somehow that inside of what we can think of as this large creative order, we want to pretend that somehow or another there's some equivalence that we have to achieve. And I'll use the example of gender because it's the least triggering topic we can bring up in this day and age. And that is entirely tongue-in-cheek. But if we look at something very simple, are men and women the same? Blah, 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 blah. All the stuff we're supposed to talk about as socially enlightened beings. If we just answer the question organically, we can actually conclusively and absolutely with evidence conclude that women are vastly superior to men in a number of social attributes, most notably the very existence that we all have. And I say that because if you look at an organic level, it is the mother's mitochondria that survives to make the infant become viable. So every human being, I don't care if you're a man or a woman, every human being is beholden to a lineal source connection from the created beginning, whatever kind of beginning you want to have, not through a man, but through a woman. Our connection to, whatever we want to call it, divine source, origins, is not masculine, it's feminine. And we want to pretend like, well, yeah, but we can will that away. Men are stronger, men are faster, whatever else. No, bullshit. The actual reality is that we have been for the last 8,000 years running from the metaphoric goddess energy, right? We've been running from it, trying to create stories to go, well, she wasn't that important, or we're not that dependent, or whatever. But it's the woman who gives us a sense of connection to source. It's the woman who gives us our sense of connection to a place called home, because in the sense of olfaction, which is the first of the cranial nerves, the first of the senses that's established in an infant in utero, that sense of connection is a chemo remembrance. So it is a chemical remembrance of what it means to have a place or a home. That's the essence of humanity. And that only comes from a woman. No man has anything to do with that at all. And so if we start looking at these fundamental fabrics, we realize every patriarchal story, every misogynist story we tell, even when we tell the feminist version of those stories, is actually based on a fundamental organic lie. It is women that tell the story of origins. It's women who tell the story of home, not because they're better at it. In fact, I would criticize women for not doing a very good job of showing up as accountable for the things they control. But the fact of the matter is, we have an ontology and epistemology that's broken around gender. And if we actually want a better system, we better actually come into contact with that reality. And then ultimately, we wonder why we feel isolated. Well, we feel isolated because we're breaking the organic chain that is the organic nature of being human. So that's kind of a dumb idea. And then what I actually find fascinating is that the derivative of that, because we're trying to perpetually rationalize an irrationality we have imposed. And now it's time to beat up on men a little bit, right? We've imposed the irrationality, and then we're trying every way we can to try to figure out how to rationalize a fundamentally irrational posture, which is pretty dumb if you say it that way. It is with no surprise that, David, right now we are seeing record numbers of men in their young and middle age suiciding. And I would go as far as to suggest to you, and we can socially argue about the merits of this argument, but I think it's at least worth considering. I think the advent of war was actually mass suicide. I don't think it was conflict. I think if you go back through human history and you go, why did we invent war? I think we invented war because men ultimately could not resolve their identity context and decided that conflict was in fact the way to move through the world. And at a certain sense of that conflict welling up within inside the masculine, didn't know what to do. War was not only a certain outcome, but an innovation to socially accept suicide. And I think that that's a pretty interesting observation. And I think the evidence is so graphically present across 8,000 years. Because if you go back far enough into the Assyrian, Sumerian, Mesopotamian stories, the minute we move away from our sense of the goddess, our sense of more of at least a matrilineal, if not matriarchal system, we see this proliferation of war. But if we actually examine the underlying elements of that proliferation, I think what you find is that war was just a socially acceptable suicide for men who could not resolve their conflicts. And so when you take that lens and you go, oh my God, maybe we have an 8,000-year-old or 9,000-year-old socialization epistemology we have to re-examine, then we're in a very different conversation. Because now it's not just what happens in 2028. Now it's, what does it really mean to have a social system, a relationship system, a economic system? What is it? What does it mean to be fully human? Which kind of comes around to the punchline of what I'm trying to navigate on my own personal journey, which is, can I get to a place where I can at least examine the inputs enough to say, with a high degree of confidence, by the way, I don't think I've ever met a human on this planet. And by that, I mean a fully enabled, fully functioning, fully aligned with, the essence of the species, I don't think I've met a single fully functioning human, myself included. I think the man in the mirror still is working on getting a lot of nonsense out of the way. And that's kind of pretty important.
Can I take you back a few sentences or a few minutes? I shared with you before this talk today the matrix model.
Yes, exactly.
I love your, I really enjoyed your observation that yes, that is the matrix. If, like we've got today, we can describe how it's going to self-destruct itself.
Yeah.
And actually, we should celebrate the end of that matrix and start to think about the reverse of that, which is what are we going to do instead?
Yes,
How
indeed.
which I'd like to come on to. So in the UK, and I think in the US as well, and in other Western countries around the world, there appear to me to be three big themes going on everywhere. One is the economy appears everywhere to be heading towards bankruptcy, whether it's in 2028 or whatever. Culture is in peril, where immigration without integration, on one hand, war with other cultures. And it's almost like every day in the news in the UK, people saying, well, in Europe and the UK joining Europe's military, they're just heading for a war because war always seems to be the destination for the reasons you've just outlined.
Correct.
And thirdly, governance, where the social contract is completely broken. So looking at our matrix diagram, I've got 5 questions I'd love us to unpack. So at the matrix core, we're outlining wars on identity, freedom, nature, and the mind. So what's the unifying mechanism behind this interconnected system of control? And what's its ultimate goal for humanity's future?
Well, I think there's a metaphysical that we have to at least touch on from the standpoint of conceptually consider that somewhere along the line, there's a beneficiary of at least our distraction, if not overtly our energy. If I can create a shiny object that creates an addiction to fear, to scarcity, to shame, to a controlled sense of emasculation or impotence as a society, then I instantaneously create this very patriarchal system of there's somebody who has my succor, they have my they are the benefactor, and therefore I have to depend on them. So there's an externalization of human energy. And I think at the core of all of those things is at least implicit in the system, a need to reify the structures of power by virtue of preying, in a very parasitic sense, on the masses, right? If we all acquiesce to, yes, you are the all-powerful, yes, you are the one that can tax me, and you are the one that can control my health and destiny and everything else, then I have to become subjugated to that system. And I think that the subjugation is, at least at an implicit level, how the system maintains its power. So if people were fully in their sense of power, if they actually saw themselves with agency, then all of that system would crumble in an instant. So you have to maintain these addictions to, whether it's imposed addictions of taxation or of dependence for healthcare or food or infrastructure or energy or whatever. You build out these chains that are forged out of what we call necessity. And then we wonder why we feel chained to the wall. But we forged the chains. We were the ones that said we needed to have, our Starbucks coffee, and we were the ones that needed to have our highways, and we were the ones that needed to have 60 hertz into every house. We didn't need that. In fact, there are people who are part of my ancestry that live in Pennsylvania right now, still don't have a touch of electricity, and they're doing quite fine. So, so the fact of the matter is, we've created a set of illusions, and then we've built the dependencies into the illusions, and not surprisingly, those illusions are not of our creation. We are told we need those things by the purveyors of the solution of what we need. And so if you look at the core, what's inside of that matrix, it's dependency, it's subjugation, it's shame. And shame, if I had to pick one thing, I would say that's the biggest thing. Because the only way you can diminish your self-perception, the only way, is to have something around which you feel judged to be somehow inadequate. And I think central to all of these things, David, is this insidious, just pervasive sense of a lot of people just live from beginning to end of life with some sense of an inadequacy, with some sense of shame. And I think the system put it in at the origin of each life, and I think that it lives very healthily all the way to the end of life. And I think breaking the pattern of shame, being able to step fully into your humanity, is the only way out of that.
So what's the antidote to this war on agency and identity?
Well, I think part of the reason, and I said this at the beginning in our introduction, I feel like one of the greatest contributions I've made has nothing to do with the videos and facts that I've shared with the world. I think the greatest contributions I've made is sharing my humanity, being able to be a person who appears to have an influence, who appears to have certain sense of power or agency or what have you. And I share my personal journey. I share the humanity of the places where I've not always been, the best husband or the best father or the best executive or the best whatever else. But the point of it is not to self-flagellate. The point is to say, you can admit to the parts of your life you're still working on, and it doesn't rob you of your effectiveness. In fact, it endears you to a population who goes, thank God somebody's at least telling the truth. They don't have their, everything figured out. They don't have all of their life, roses. And I think that there's a humanity, which particularly those of us who do have at least a certain sense of gravitas and presence in the world, I think that the antidote is to have people who are perceived in authority roles have both the decency and honesty to say, why don't you come out and say, and I'm struggling with this, or I had a tough experience here, or you know what, I had a financial patch that was really hard for me to navigate, or I had a relationship that was very hard for me to work my way through, or I have a personal challenge that I'm still trying to work through. And the point is, by humanizing the experience, you realize that the agency that is lost through this assassination of the ego is actually not lost agency at all. It's a more accessible human connection where people can then have a binding affinity to the authentic, transparent interaction. And I think that that's the antidote. I think when we start seeing, you may go through a tough patch. You may call me and say, hey, Dave, I'm going through a tough patch. And I can say, let me tell you how I navigated that tough patch in my life. Well, what did we just do? You were vulnerable. I was vulnerable. We shared that vulnerability. But what we really did was we opened up a conduit to share wisdom and insight where neither one of us diminished each other, right? You weren't diminished because of your condition. I wasn't diminished because of mine, but I'm sharing wisdom and insight that I've gleaned through navigating these things. And in doing that, what I've done is truly created the antidote to shame. Because the minute I realize it's not just me and I'm not alone and I'm not the only one that's ever had to navigate this, then I start feeling like, oh, well, maybe I'm surviving, and then maybe somebody else can survive, and maybe I can share the tools and the experiences that I've picked up to get through that experience. And before long, you start realizing, oh, we don't need an out there power. We don't need that paternalistic view that says, I am the all provider and you are the all needer. No, you're not. I'm not. At certain places, I'm wonderful to be, the nurturing support of somebody. And in other times, I need the nurturing support. And guess what? That's part of life. But I think the more we can pierce the illusion of those in power also must have all their shit figured out. It's simply not true. And if we can face that and embrace that reality, I think we go a long way in breaking the paradigm.
Going back to something we talked about half an hour ago, an idea that I have been modeling for the new system, the new is what I've ended up calling wisdom councils.
Yeah, brilliant. And a good word, a very good word. Yes.
So imagine the conversation we were having earlier on about this moral dilemma between admitting that they're not safe and effective and having to deal with the trillions of dollars of damage claims versus allowing people to continue to be injured or harmed by them, knowing that that will lead to deaths and further economic turmoil. It's like at the moment, there's 650 MPs in the UK, most of whom are probably clueless about all of this anyway. There's a prime minister who never talks about it, never seems to engage it, and he's probably clueless too. And there's a bunch of people hidden who are unelected and unaccountable who made all this happen. But if we put together 100, 1,000 diverse people, from different backgrounds, reasonably educated, reasonably curious, reasonably good critical thinking skills. And we said, okay, here is the potential liability and cost of admitting we made a mistake. And here's the moral dilemma of allowing more deaths and disabilities and harm. What are we going to do?
Well, in South Africa, they had the Truth and Reconciliation exercise at the end of apartheid. And while that had all of its foibles, and it did, there were a lot of deficiencies in what they did, but the principle was sound. Because the principle was you can never get to reconciliation without transparency and truth. So you have to get to a place where the perpetrators have the ability to acknowledge what they did, how they did it, and they can't be met with a vilification because they were operating in the framework of the system that they were operating. Unlike Nuremberg, the Truth and Reconciliation process with the South African story was one where people on both, the extremes were able to acknowledge the crimes that they perpetrated, the nature of, what they did, how they did it, dates, times, everything else. And the reconciliation part was actually part of an old Commonwealth law construct. And this goes back to, by the way, certainly at least a millennium BCE, where we have this idea of reconciliation or redemption. And both of these are very interesting concepts. Reconciliation is not, I'm sorry, right? This is where Australia went off the bullshit line. And they just said, well, we're going to have a genocide of all the Aboriginals and then just go, sorry, we took your land, right? That's nonsense. And it was a failure from the get-go. South Africa did something slightly different. What they said was we need reconciliation. Now, I'm not lauding South Africa as a case. I think the construct is what we have to come back and look at. The idea was that insofar as you have done harm, then the harming party has to give agency to and enable a recovery of status, of power, of agency, whatever that is, to the harmed party. And this is really critical. It's not just, oops, we made a mistake. In common law, we have a thing called fraudulent inducement. This is Commonwealth law. And fraudulent inducement is when you perpetrated a harm. The penalty for fraudulent inducement is the restoration of the pre-aggrieved state. Mm-hmm. Okay? And this is where I think the real genius of how we would get through this would happen. You would have your wisdom council. That's fair and correct. But you would also have an agreement that says that the parties who in fact benefited, so this is the people that got paid to do the injections, and the corner pharmacy that got whatever it was, a £100 bonus for every shot they gave, or in the United States, the $40,000 that every hospital got for murdering people with remdesivir. It's a disgorgement of that benefit. You do not get to keep the ill-gotten gain. This is a repatriation. This is a restoration. And that piece, I think, diffuses the social time bomb that goes off in the absence of it. I've often said that the reason why there wasn't a civil war in South Africa after apartheid was because the Civil War was exported to Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. Because empirically, that's true. The crazies, who were the extremists, the Afrikaans extremists, came up and became hyper right-wing radicals in Europe. And the people who thought the ANC was too accommodating went up and started creating civil wars all the way up into, South Sudan. The war happened. It just didn't happen in South Africa. So ironically, the bomb went off. But it went off in this fragmented space where radicals, knowing that there was going to be a conflict, took the conflict somewhere else. And if you ever look at that, it's fascinating as all get out. Look at the rise of the ultra right in Europe after apartheid ended, and you go, well, how did that happen? And you go back and look and go, holy cow! The guy who was at Stellenbosch was the guy who did the thing in Europe, and so this idea that we've made it diffuse is interesting. But I come back to the point. Reconciliation involves restitution. It involves recovery of the pre-aggrieved state. And it's in Commonwealth law. It's not Dave Martin's idea. It's a good idea.
So a simple example of what you're suggesting is the PR company that was given £50 million by the government to come up with safe and effective and reduce vaccine hesitancy. They'd have to give the 50 million back.
And put in place an education program to help highlight how they corrupted the social messaging so that the public becomes informed of the tools that were used to co-opt the public. So it's not good enough to give the money back. I know that there were studies done in the US and the UK on how to message the attacks on people like me. Well, guess what? The people who did it now need to disclose how they did it. Why? So that it doesn't have the capacity to be engaged again. Right? So this is not just diffusing the bomb. It's discussing the anatomy of explosives and saying, if you ever see a thing like this again, it's a bomb. So you can recognize it. And I think that this is the piece that's missing. It's not just the punitive piece, which is, you got 50 million pounds, I'm going to give it back. No, you're going to teach the public now how to detect your manipulation so you do not manipulate again. And that becomes the critical piece of restitution, where it's genuine reconciliation to the human narrative that says, we preyed on, we know you to be foolish or gullible or whatever else. We preyed on that. We are going to tell you how we preyed on you so that you are no longer prey.
No, I love that idea. So, over the course of the next probably 6 months, we've identified through lots of research the topics that aren't being discussed in the mainstream media, aren't being discussed in the House of Parliament, that people in the UK are worried about, whether it's bowware or climate change or net zero or geoengineering or fluoride or mRNA shots. And we're looking at how do we get all of the bad stuff stopped, but all sitting inside that matrix. And we know that what we're going to need to do is not only point out that the matrix is there and how it operates and why it should be stopped, but we've also got to come up with its replacement. And I'd love in a few months' time to get you back and do a conversation not about the matrix and all the horror stories we've talked about today, but how what we replace it with. And
I would look forward to that. I think it's lovely, and I've been doing since 1998. I had what I refer to as the three axes of social organization, the ways in which we view the world through what I have denominated as integral accounting. What I do is I have built in all of the three axes of human organization pathways to try to start tackling the what next question, and just more than anything else, just have a seat at the table when the next is happening to make sure that there's an opportunity to at least shape part of that conversation. And so it's been a lot of fun, but that would be a topic for another hour that it's not this one.
It would indeed. I think that my reading in the UK and in America too, over the last 3 to 6 months and no more, is the number of people who recognize that the system is completely broken. And I can share it with you offline, but we've actually done a research of all the polls and studies in the UK. In fact, I think I sent it to you, didn't I?
Yeah, you did. I've been through it. Yep.
Yeah. And those polls and studies showing how unhappy and fearful and worried the average Brit is, that there's more and more every day. And the thing that comes across, which is very pleasing, is that well over 40% say the system is beyond repair and it needs replacing. This isn't turning up and twisting that dial and flicking that switch and pulling that lever back. It needs a whole new system. And I love your idea that those who, if you like, perpetrated all the crimes not only need to give the money back, but they also need to be honest with what they did and how they did it, so we can flag it if ever it happened again in the future. I'm going to wrap up now, because we've been going for an hour and 20 minutes. The last time you and I chatted, I think we chatted for about 2 hours. Said we should have recorded that.
Exactly.
I can't thank you enough for giving up time so early in the morning for you, and having this conversation. I know that you know this, but we want to create not only, help create a new system, but we want to create a new way for people to be engaging in these conversations, truth speaking in a safe way where we can explore opposing points of view and even information and say, well, how can that be true if that's true? But it looks like they could both be true. So let's explore and examine. And if we figure out that one of them isn't true, then having the grace to say, well, even though I always thought that was true, it's clearly not true. And I've got to take it on board. But sometimes I think it's going to require, well, that is true. And so is that. And actually, we need to find a way to weave them together so it benefits humanity. And so we're determined to do that. You have always been very kind and generous, responding to every email I've ever sent you, and we've chatted about a number of things. I hope very much that we can stay in touch and that you will love the recording we end up doing of this, and you'll share it to your audience on X, because that's the group of people that we want to let know about the Truth Contract, and we want to make this conversation international as well as just in the UK. So David, thank you very much indeed. I know it's
always a pleasure, always an honor. Thank you for the time.
I know it's like 8:20 in where you are in the world in the morning. So go off and have a lovely day, and thank you very much
for giving up. All right. Take care.